Shopping for a modern mattress nowadays feels shockingly less like simple retail therapy and far more like desperately applying for a high-interest mortgage on a glorified fabric rectangle. We are relentlessly bombarded with dizzying promises of space-age memory foam, high-tech cooling gel, suspiciously calculated orthopedic zones, a stressful 100-night trial period, and somehow, a single fluffy pillow that inexplicably costs more than a healthy farmyard goat. Yet, for nearly the entire sweeping span of human history, absolutely nobody had access to a brightly lit bed showroom. There were no bouncy steel springs, no frustratingly tight-fitted sheets, and certainly no tiny, ominous warning tags threatening severe legal consequences if maliciously removed. So, how on earth did our ancient ancestors manage to sleep through the night without waking up as a stiffly frozen, insect-covered midnight appetizer? The most glaringly obvious answer is, of course, that they slept on the cold ground, but stating that is a little like casually claiming that early humans crossed vast, treacherous oceans merely in wood. While technically true, it remains impressively and delightfully unhelpful. Our clever ancestors did not simply collapse in a heap wherever gravity happened to abruptly drop them. Instead, they carefully selected strategic locations, painstakingly constructed rudimentary sleeping surfaces, masterfully controlled fire, cleverly utilized local plants, shared mutual protection, and slowly, painstakingly turned one of the most perilous, vulnerable moments in daily life into something resembling cozy comfort. Almost, that is, because long before humans could ever dream of inventing the mattress, they first had to solve a far more terrifyingly urgent problem. Specifically, how does one sleep deeply without immediately being eaten alive? Before the very concept of a bed could exist, our ancient ancestors had to resolve a much older, more fundamental sleeping dilemma. Where precisely do you store a completely unconscious, helpless primate? For millions of long, dark years, the safest and most logical answer was undoubtedly up. Many living apes still meticulously build cozy sleeping platforms high in the canopy, skillfully bending sturdy branches into surprisingly comfortable nests. These are certainly not random, messy piles of autumn leaves. Chimpanzees, for instance, thoughtfully select flexible, resilient branches, carefully arrange them into a secure bowl shape, and then gently add a plush layer of leafy material right on top. It is, quite basically, bespoke custom furniture, except the eccentric delivery crew is also the demanding customer, and they occasionally throw half-eaten fruit at passing strangers. Sleeping high in the trees made perfect sense for smaller, lighter primates. This natural elevation drastically reduced unwanted contact with hungry ground predators, biting nocturnal insects, damp soil, and the specific sort of terrifying nighttime surprise that typically begins with a pair of glowing eyes in the dark. But as our evolutionary lineage grew steadily larger, more strictly terrestrial, and significantly better adapted for walking upright on two legs, sleeping high above the forest floor became decidedly less convenient. A heavy-bodied, clumsy hominin wobbling on precarious branches is not a majestic sight. It is a catastrophic workplace lawsuit waiting to happen. Transitioning to ground sleeping, however, presented a brutal and unforgiving trade-off. The forest floor was undeniably easier to reach, far easier to gather around, and vastly better for fostering tight-knit social groups. But it was also, rather inconveniently, exactly where the lions lived. To make terrestrial sleep even remotely possible, early humans needed far more than raw courage. They required innovative technology, fierce cooperation, and a particular talent that modern humans still happily employ every single night: the knack for turning a hostile, dangerous environment into a safe, controlled little bubble. In this quest, fire was arguably the single biggest game-changer. A carefully maintained campfire offered comforting warmth, flickering light, repelling smoke, and at least some reliable protection from wild beasts that preferred their midnight snacks slightly less illuminated. Furthermore, the crackling hearth beautifully extended social bonding time long after sunset. Gathered snugly around the protective fire, a cohesive group could leisurely eat, repair vital tools, tenderly care for children, communicate, and collaboratively debate who exactly had just heard that highly suspicious rustling noise in the nearby bushes. The deliberate choice of shelter mattered immensely as well. A sturdy rock overhang could easily block howling wind and driving rain, while an elevated patch of dry ground prevented a sleeping hominin from accidentally becoming part of the local drainage system during a storm. Even in the total absence of solid walls, strategic location was, in itself, a form of brilliant architecture. Then, of course, there was the immense safety of group size. Sleeping close to others meant more alert ears, more sensitive noses, and significantly higher chances that someone would frantically wake up before a hungry leopard could successfully execute its evening dinner plans. Intriguingly, human groups also naturally contained wonderfully diverse sleep patterns. Some individuals were biologically destined to stay awake later, while others naturally rose with the dawn. In a small, vulnerable camp, this genetic variation likely created highly useful, overlapping periods of protective vigilance, leaving very few moments when absolutely everyone was deeply, helplessly asleep. This does not mean prehistoric camps operated an official night shift equipped with clipboards and high-visibility vests. Rather, it means that ordinary, everyday biological differences became incredibly useful survival mechanisms. And once the holy trinity of fire, cooperation, and secure campsites finally made ground sleeping a viable option, our weary ancestors could at last turn their attention to the sweet pursuit of pure comfort. They carefully selected dry, sheltered locations. They diligently avoided exposed, drafty winds. And they lovingly gathered soft, fragrant plants to cushion their nightly rest. They may have used thick animal hides and diligently built repeated, semi-permanent sleeping areas. In those ancient, rugged times, the very first bed was not a rigid, nicely polished piece of wooden furniture at all. Instead, it was a clever, survival-focused strategy. The earliest beds were probably discovered in the exact same delightfully lazy way that humans have discovered almost all of their most useful inventions. Frankly, somebody simply grew utterly exhausted from being chronically uncomfortable and decided to start haphazardly moving wild plants around. Picture the agonizing problem they faced nightly. The bare ground is a notorious thief that relentlessly steals precious body heat, greedily collects damp moisture, enthusiastically attracts hungry insects, and inexplicably contains sharp, jagged rocks placed with highly suspicious, near-malicious accuracy directly beneath the sensitive human spine. Even without possessing the slightest scientific clue about the complex laws of thermodynamics, these resourceful early humans would have easily noticed that a delightfully thick, fluffy layer of dry grass felt infinitely warmer than the unforgiving, bare soil. Soft leaves added a much-needed touch of luxury. Breathable reeds cleverly created refreshing airflow. Heavy animal hides could effectively block the biting wind and significantly reduce direct contact with the freezing cold surface below. Mercifully, nobody actually needed to invent the concept of comfort from thin air. They only had to closely observe their wild neighbors. After all, other clever animals were already masterfully constructing cozy nests. Energetic birds expertly built them. Fuzzy rodents meticulously lined their underground burrows. Quite impressively, our close relatives, the great apes, neatly arranged sturdy branches and soft leaves into elevated, comfortable sleeping platforms. Thus, our prehistoric ancestors descended from a wonderfully long, proud evolutionary tradition of aggressively manipulating local vegetation before hitting the hay. Once certain adventurous hominins boldly began sleeping more regularly on the hard ground, this cozy habit easily traveled wherever they wandered. The traditional, high-altitude tree nest simply transitioned into a down-to-earth floor nest. However, this ground bedding came with one massive, rather horrifying flaw. Quickly became utterly disgusting. A messy pile of grass utilized night after night would inevitably collect sticky sweat, decomposing food fragments, flakes of shed skin, curious insects, and whatever bizarre, gooey object the prehistoric toddler had been happily clutching just 5 minutes earlier. Bloodthirsty fleas and other creepy pests certainly would not view this accumulating pile as a terrible hygiene crisis. On the contrary, they would enthusiastically view it as a prime piece of real estate, ripe for rapid urban development. This disgusting reality likely explains why these earliest sleeping surfaces were highly temporary, regularly discarded, or enthusiastically burned. Thankfully, fresh, clean plant material could be easily gathered nearby, while the old, smelly bedding could be casually swept aside or gleefully set on fire. Torching the old bed would efficiently remove smelly waste, destroy some of those unwelcome parasites, and leave behind dry ash, which is thankfully much less welcoming to tiny crawling insects than damp, rotting organic material. The rising smoke undoubtedly helped, too. A heavily smoky shelter is admittedly quite unpleasant when you are actively trying to breathe, but it is also exceptionally unpleasant when you happen to be a thirsty mosquito. These early humans certainly did not need to understand complex insect chemistry. They only needed to simply notice that certain fragrant plants smelled incredibly strong when crushed or burned, and that sleeping peacefully near them resulted in slightly less agonizing midnight scratching. This is precisely where bedding begins to look significantly less like a lucky, chaotic accident and much more like a brilliant library of accumulated prehistoric knowledge. One observant person notices that dry, curly sedges are noticeably softer. Another discovers through coughing fits that green, fresh branches smoke far too much. Someone else happily discovers that a particular, highly aromatic leaf reliably discourages annoying insects. These tiny, brilliant observations were diligently remembered, eagerly copied, and proudly taught to others. Over countless generations, a mere sleeping spot slowly transformed into a meticulously constructed, highly functional environment. There was dry, insulated ground beneath, cushioned plant layers directly above, a crackling fire safely nearby, trusted companions tightly huddled around the vulnerable edges, and perhaps a heavy animal hide snugly pulled over the shivering body when nighttime temperatures began to plunge. Granted, it still would not remotely resemble a sleek, modern bedroom. There was absolutely zero privacy, no peaceful silence, and almost certainly no domestic rule against eating messy snacks right where you slept. But the core comforting principle was already deeply familiar. Long before lying down to rest, humans thoughtfully prepared the wild world beneath them. Of course, delicate wild grass does not usually survive for a staggering 200,000 years. It rapidly decomposes, burns away, gets ruthlessly trampled into fine dust, or is hungrily eaten by some passing animal with absolutely no respect whatsoever for future archaeologists. That is precisely what makes the famous Border Cave so incredibly remarkable. Securely located in the rugged Lubombo Mountains on the scenic border of South Africa and Eswatini, this miraculous cave preserves microscopic, fossilized traces of genuine grass bedding dating back at least a mind-blowing 200,000 years. Patient researchers found these ancient plant remains neatly concentrated toward the cozy rear of the shelter, where prehistoric people appear to have deliberately created comfortable, cushioned surfaces for sleeping, resting, and working. This was definitely not just random grass lazily tossed onto the bare dirt. Fascinatingly, much of it rested directly on thick, deliberate layers of ash. While this ash may have occasionally formed quite naturally from previous, abandoned fires, the repeated, consistent association strongly suggests that these clever people sometimes deliberately and systematically placed their fresh bedding right over it. The reason was probably highly practical. Fine, powdery ash could conveniently obstruct the tiny, unwelcome breathing systems of thirsty ticks and other creeping, crawling arthropods, thoroughly absorb excess moisture, and make it delightfully difficult for these pesky pests to wander around. In other words, humanity's very oldest known mattress may have also come quite handily with built-in, pre-installed bug control. Intrigued researchers also discovered tiny, microscopic fragments of fragrant camphor bushwood nestled snugly among the ancient bedding remains. Plants in this botanical group naturally produce highly aromatic compounds that can quite effectively repel pesky insects. Although modern archaeologists cannot definitively prove exactly why those fragrant branches reached the cozy sleeping area, they may have simply been convenient fuel, accidental debris, or perhaps a deliberate, highly innovative prehistoric version of modern mosquito spray. The brutally honest answer, of course, is that the local bugs of that era are tragically unavailable for comment. Border Cave also contained telltale layers of burned grass and heavily charred material, strongly suggesting that those ancient, dusty surfaces were periodically and dramatically destroyed. Safely burning the used bedding would have cleanly cleared away accumulated waste and efficiently toasted any remaining pests before a fresh, crisp layer of grass was carefully installed. Naturally, this was not meticulous housekeeping in the modern, obsessive sense. Nobody was delicately fluffing decorative throw pillows. But it was 77 undeniably a repeated, organized management of domestic space, which represents a surprisingly sophisticated cognitive behavior for our ancient ancestors. Later, fascinating evidence from Cebudu, another remarkable South African rock shelter, makes this domestic pattern even clearer. Around 77,000 long years ago, the industrious people there meticulously constructed comfortable bedding from coarse sedges and other generous, broad-leaved grasses. Some of these leafy layers were thoughtfully topped with the fragrant leaves of Cryptocarya woodii, a local tree whose potent aromatic chemicals boast impressive insect-killing and bug-repelling properties. By roughly 58,000 years ago, bedding at Cebudu was being burned with impressive regularity, perhaps as a routine part of mundane camp maintenance. Persistent archaeologists discovered multiple, heavily compacted layers of plant material, powdery ash, and everyday occupation debris, clearly showing that the rock shelter floor was repeatedly, lovingly prepared and renewed. Granted, these fascinating sites do not magically offer us a perfectly preserved, complete prehistoric bedroom. Delicate organic materials rarely survive the harsh passage of millennia, so cozy animal hides, sturdy wooden bed frames, warm blankets, and soft pillows may have easily existed without leaving any clear, lasting evidence. But these humble grass remains are more than enough to completely overturn the outdated image of ancient humans simply passing out cold on hard, bare stone. An impressive 200,000 years ago, thoughtful people were already deliberately choosing specific sleeping zones, laying down soft vegetation, strategically using protective ash, actively managing pesky insects, and thoroughly cleaning old surfaces with purifying fire. They did not actually sleep without beds. They simply slept without the questionable convenience of modern furniture stores. Archaeology, of course, is spectacularly excellent at telling us that ancient people placed grass on cave floors. It is, however, much less capable of telling us whether some poor soul woke up sweating at 2 o'clock in the morning, stared blankly into the dying fire, and deeply regretted some incredibly awkward thing they said during a stressful mammoth hunt. That is precisely where hard physical evidence ends and wild, intriguing hypotheses begin. One highly popular idea is that ancient humans slept in two entirely separate, distinct phases, waking up for a wonderfully quiet, reflective interval in the dead middle of the night. Historical records from much later, literate societies vividly describe a first sleep and a second sleep, with industrious people eagerly using the dark gap to pray, talk, work, visit sleeping neighbors, or apparently make nighttime far more ridiculously productive than it has any biological right to be. But, of course, those intriguing historical records do not definitively prove that all prehistoric humans slept in that exact split fashion. Sleep patterns are wildly shaped by geographic latitude, changing seasons, fluctuating temperature, artificial light, exhausting daily labor, lurking danger, and local culture. A freezing winter camp in Ice Age Europe may have naturally followed a very different, sleepier rhythm from a sweaty tropical foraging group residing near the equator. Furthermore, modern studies of diverse, non-industrial communities also beautifully complicate this simplistic picture. Real people living quite happily without electric lighting do not necessarily fall fast asleep the very moment the sun disappears. Instead, they may cheerfully remain awake around roaring fires, socialize, gossip, and finally drift off to sleep several hours later. Their nocturnal rest is often highly flexible and chaotic rather than neatly divided into one supposedly natural pattern. Then, of course, there is the stressful question of constant vigilance, because hungry predators, hostile rival groups, runaway fires, crying infants, and suddenly collapsing weather systems absolutely did not respect a designated bedtime. Consequently, clever researchers have proposed that ancient camps benefited tremendously from people sleeping at slightly different times. Fascinating studies of present-day hunter-gatherers humorously suggest that natural, biological differences in age and chronotype, the classic early birds versus begrudging night owls, can produce near-continuous nighttime activity within a group. This makes perfect sense. It is a highly practical, fluid arrangement rather than some rigidly fossilized prehistoric security schedule. We also absolutely cannot confidently reconstruct the delightfully awkward prehistoric sleeping positions of our ancestors. Early humans might have curled themselves into tight, shivering balls for warmth, dozed perilously close to crackling fires, slumped uncomfortably against damp cave walls, shared smelly animal hides, or simply collapsed with children and weary companions pressed snugly together in a massive, breathing pile. Certain humid environments may have cleverly encouraged the use of breezy hammocks or elevated platforms, while more temperate locales favored basic, itchy grass beds on sheltered ground. Even Neanderthal bedrooms must be approached with extreme caution. Ancient caves certainly contain hearths, discarded tools, random animal bones, and various activity zones, but slapped-on modern room labels tend to make these chaotic ancient spaces seem far tidier and more organized than they actually were. A cozy sleeping area might easily transform into a bloody butchering station the very next morning, only to become a chaotic workshop for noisy tool repair right after dinner. Alas, prehistoric life did not come with neat IKEA floor plans. Thus, the safest, most sensible conclusion is certainly not that our ancient ancestors possessed some singular, magically perfect natural method of sleeping. They simply adapted. They constantly shifted locations, swapped materials, managed fire use, reshuffled group arrangements, and adjusted their chaotic sleeping schedules according to fickle local conditions. There was absolutely no universal ancestral bedtime. Instead, there was only the grimly hilarious nightly challenge of falling unconscious without accidentally becoming dead. Once ingenious humans managed to make sleeping on the ground slightly safer, sleep triumphantly stopped being merely a mandatory biological shutdown and evolved into a lively social event. A campsite at night was not just a random collection of exhausted, snoring bodies. It was a brilliantly organized, organic system of shared warmth, mutual protection, tender caregiving, and vital information. People eagerly gathered near the crackling fire because fire was immensely useful, but also primarily because everyone else was already gathered there. That, funnily enough, is how civilization usually begins, with a highly practical solution that quite accidentally morphs into profound meaning. Snuggling close together dramatically reduced precious heat loss in freezing environments and made it remarkably easier to protect fragile infants, groaning injured adults, and vulnerable older group members. A terrified child waking in the pitch dark did not have to wander off to search for comfort. Comfort was loudly breathing mere inches away, quite probably using someone else's numb arm as a makeshift pillow. Naturally, this cozy closeness also birthed a whole new set of domestic responsibilities. Fires demanded constant fuel. Whining children required soothing. Strange, eerie noises in the bushes desperately needed interpretation. Someone had to courageously decide whether that ominous rustling just beyond the firelight was merely the wind, a hungry predator, or just Uncle Bob returning from an unnecessarily dramatic midnight bathroom trip. Nighttime may therefore have wonderfully strengthened social cooperation. During the hectic daylight hours, people scattered to hunt, gather, travel, and work. But after dark, movement became perilous, and the group naturally became more concentrated. This forced proximity created precious time for gossip, instruction, strategic planning, and, of course, storytelling. Fireside stories were never simply mind-numbing entertainment. They served as vital oral databases, preserving crucial information about terrifying predators, seasonal plants, hidden water sources, complex social obligations, and embarrassing past mistakes. A highly memorable, terrifying story about foolish grog ignoring giant tracks near the riverbank was infinitely easier to retain than some boring, formal safety manual titled 10 Good Reasons Not to Pet the Crocodile. Frequently repeated sleeping sites could also slowly develop deep, sentimental meaning. A highly protected cave, a familiar, shady grove, or a reliable campsite might eventually become sacredly associated with particular families, revered ancestors, solemn rituals, or festive seasonal gatherings. The very same spot used for nightly rest could also seamlessly host physical healing, communal mourning, generous food sharing, and elaborate ceremonies. Sleep and sacred ritual naturally overlapped because both profoundly required vulnerable humans to enter highly altered states under the watchful, protective eyes of others. Gradually, as human settlements became more permanent, these chaotic sleeping areas became significantly more structured. Floors were swept clean and diligently resurfaced. Hearths were strategically placed. Walls and roofs vastly improved thermal insulation. Elevated wooden platforms successfully separated warm bodies from the chilly, damp ground, unsanitary waste, and aggressively crawling nocturnal pests. Bedding became meticulously woven, softly stuffed, eagerly traded, proudly inherited, and eventually decorated far beyond anything actually required by the humble human spine. But the most monumentally important invention was not the sturdy wooden frame or the plush mattress. No, it was something far more intangible, fragile, and utterly miraculous: trust. To sleep peacefully beside other human beings is to completely surrender your conscious awareness while blindly assuming they will neither harm you, abandon you to the elements, nor casually allow some hungry predator to wander into the camp for a midnight snack. Every single shared sleeping place was, in essence, a delicate social contract tacitly renewed each and every evening. Long before humanity ever dreamt of building bustling cities, they practiced the fine art of civilization in the pitch-black dark. They kept the flickering fire alive, and, crucially, they kept each other breathing. Today, most of us slumber inside hyper-regulated, climate-controlled drywall boxes, resting atop scientifically engineered memory foam under heavy-weighted blankets designed to simulate a continuous hug, right beside our fiercely charging smartphones that glow like frantic little emergency beacons signaling crises that do not actually exist. And yet, that primal, ancient logic still rules our nocturnal minds. We are still, at our core, neurotic birds building elaborate nests. We meticulously arrange our pillows, passionately defend our chosen sides of the bed, aggressively adjust the ambient temperature, block out every microscopic speck of light, double-check the deadbolts, and defensively place familiar objects within arm's reach. Some souls require absolute, tomb-like silence to drift off. Others desperately need the white noise of a spinning fan, the simulated patter of tropical rain, a rambling podcast, or the deeply reassuring, metallic hum of a household appliance apparently preparing for immediate takeoff to Mars. These quirky habits might look thoroughly modern, but they dutifully follow a deeply ancient pattern. We must aggressively control the immediate environment before we dare surrender voluntary control of our physical bodies. That is the true essence of what a bed really is, not merely a piece of expensive furniture, but a psychological hall pass, a safe permission slip to become entirely vulnerable. Our hairy ancestors crafted that vital permission slip using simple grass, warm ash, crackling fire, crude shelters, and the physical presence of other warm bodies. We, more sophisticated but infinitely more anxious, attempt to manufacture it using steel door locks, blackout curtains, digital thermostats, and a frankly unreasonable, borderline embarrassing number of decorative pillows. The materials have certainly changed, but the fundamental existential problem remains completely unaltered. Even the agony of modern insomnia carries a vivid, echoing whisper of that distant past. The complex human brain was never designed to simply click off with the effortless efficiency of a modern laptop. Instead, it tirelessly monitors the room temperature, stray noises, lingering social tensions, physical hunger, minor illnesses, and potential predators. Sometimes, this hypervigilance is life-saving. Other times, it unhelpfully keeps you wide awake at exactly 3:17 a.m., obsessively replaying a mildly embarrassing conversation you had with a cashier 8 long years ago. Evolution, it turns out, is not always particularly helpful or polite when it comes to keeping a schedule. The fascinating history of ancient sleep also serves to remind us that luxurious comfort did not suddenly materialize overnight with the dawn of modern civilization. It was painstakingly built, night by night, through trial, error, and shared ancestral wisdom. A slightly softer species of fern, a slightly drier corner of the cave, a more strategically placed hearth, or a fragrant leaf that pesky insects deliberately avoided. These tiny, incremental discoveries slowly accumulated over millennia until the ground itself was transformed into a clever human invention. Therefore, our ancient ancestors did not actually sleep without beds in the sad, drafty way we modern snobs like to imagine. They simply slept without squeaky bed frames, pretentious mattress brands, and the soul-crushing convenience of 12-month interest-free financing. They still lovingly prepared their sleeping spots, maintained them with pride, and fiercely protected one another around them. And across thousands of weary generations, that nightly ritual became so thoroughly ordinary that we completely forgot just how utterly extraordinary it truly is. Every single night, you willingly close your eyes and gamble on the hope that the world will not murder you for several consecutive hours. That is, when you really think about it, a breathtakingly astonishing act of faith. So, the next time you sink deep into your state-of-the-art memory foam, lovingly adjust your cooling gel pillow, and whine that the mattress feels just a tiny bit too firm, take a moment to remember where this all began. A humble pile of dried grass, boasting, of course, some truly magnificent marketing potential.